Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for hanging in there. You know, when I was looking at the schedule and noticing that we were coming after the closing plenary session, I said, uh-oh. So it's great to see you all there. And, you know, one of the things I was struck by coming to Canada, and this shouldn't be, it certainly wasn't a surprise after watching you beat us in the gold medal game. How much you know, hockey is a central part of the fabric of Canada, and you know, this conference is about making the clean energy future a central part of the future economy. And so I thought, well, you know, I can't quite speak to the hockey aspect, but in the U.S., the national pastime is baseball. So throw out a little bit of a baseball analogy. I'm the fourth up, which means I'm cleanup. Normally, the cleanup hitter has to be able to, you know, really hit well because the other guy's on base, you want to bring him home. Well, we've had 3 home runs already, so the bases are clear. My objective is just to get on base, just to get a first base hit. So, you know, with that, you know, very quickly, the Natural Resources Defense Council, we're a national nonprofit. We're U.S.-based. We have offices I'm based in New York. We have an office in D.C., San Francisco, Santa Monica, Chicago, and an office in Beijing as well. So our focus, we're a group of scientists, lawyers, policy analysts, environmental specialists, and it's, you know, it's towards environmental protection of our natural resources for future generations, of course. And of our strategic priorities, the top 2 are curbing global warming and creating a clean energy future. And so, you know, I want to talk a little bit about how does the plug-in vehicle fit into those priorities. So taking a look at this first chart, it's, when you first look at it, it could be a little daunting if you realize that this is just light-duty vehicles. What is the business as usual trajectory of what emissions could be? And you see that at the top of that blue, it could have been scaling up at quite a rate and basically the wrong direction, right? Where we want to end up is at the bottom of that gray section, which if light-duty vehicles, which there's a huge potential for greenhouse gas reductions, is going to do its fair share to meet our global goals of 450 ppm climate stability targets, then, you know, we need 80% reduction. So as you've heard in other panels today, obviously there's no silver bullet for how we're going to meet this challenge. That blue wedge there represents vehicle efficiency, and it gets to an 80 miles per gallon equivalent target. Now, my apologies for not converting that to liters per kilometer, but basically a way to think about that is a tripling of our fuel efficiency between now and 2050. Now, can we do that? Well, we've actually already seen vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, that have hit that target. And under President Clinton, there was the Partnership for a New Generation Vehicle program, and GM produced something called the Precept, which was an 80 mpg diesel hybrid. So a lot of lightweight materials. It was a hybrid, but no plug. The other pieces of the puzzle, when we talk about sort of the 3 stools for getting as solutions to our climate problem in transportation, VMT reduction is a very important piece, and then the low carbon fuels piece is where electricity, advanced biofuels, and other low carbon fuels can fit in. Now, I want to reemphasize something that Savag just said, and that is when you have a real big problem, or you have actually when you have 3 big problems, you don't want to solve them one after the other after the other. And I would add to that, you don't want to try to solve one that makes another one worse. So fortunately, we have solutions, clean energy solutions for transportation that deal with the 3 big problems of 1, global warming, 2, the use of oil, and 3, local air quality. And you know, from an oil perspective, the solutions that we looked at to create this graph, the Obama administration, when they were campaigning, they said, you know, in 10 years we want to reduce our imports by the equivalent of what we import today from the Middle East and Venezuela. And that was about 3.6 million barrels per day. Well, we looked at a series of measures like these and across the transportation sector where our oil is used, and we got to 4 million barrels per day. So we can absolutely do it, and we need to do it in a way that's reducing our greenhouse gas pollution at the same time as reducing our oil consumption. So that means moving to cleaner alternative fuels. As Brad mentioned, we took a look. Thanks. We took a look at the roles that plug-in vehicles could take by partnering with Electric Power Research Institute in this study. And this is actually, the study was done, it was completed back in 2007, and we're talking with the same folks to take another look at this and expand it out from sort of typical on-road vehicles to vehicles that are used in off-road applications and other sources of electrification. There's 2 volumes to this report. One, we looked at greenhouse gases, and the other, we looked at air quality. And I'm just going to walk through very quickly some of the results. And just from a methodology perspective, what we looked at was large-scale implementation of hybrids, plug-in hybrids, in a actually very aggressive timeline. Then we looked at the carbon content of the grid, carbon intensity of the grid getting cleaner over time. So we basically factored in a carbon policy because that's what we felt like what the future was going to be. So if you look right in the middle there, that 468, that's kind of the middle scenario. That's a modest reduction in our carbon intensity of the grid, and 2050 in this scenario, you had about 60% of the vehicles on the road being plug-in hybrids, and that's a combination of plug-in hybrids with an electric range. Most of them had a 40-mile electric range, some 20 and some 10. So that kind of reduction is equivalent to taking about 82 million vehicles off the road. That's roughly taking a third of our light-duty vehicles off the road today. And of course, there's a large oil benefit from that as well. But if we clean up the grid further, this is all about a parallel path, right? This is about getting electrified vehicles on the road at the same time that you are cleaning up the grid. So consistent with what Konstantin was talking about, where we are today, we have electric vehicles certainly provide a benefit in context from a greenhouse gas perspective versus conventional vehicles on the road. We can make sure that that benefit grows, and we're getting bigger and bigger benefits even versus efficient hybrids if we clean up the grid. We absolutely have to do that. If we're going to meet the global warming challenge that's before us, we have to have a clean grid as well. I mean, that between transportation and the electric sector, that's 2/3 of the global warming pollution that we produce in the U.S. As I mentioned, the report was in 2 volumes. So the second volume dealt with air quality. And one of the benefits that comes from this is that in the U.S., the regulations say that power plant nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide pollution is capped. That means if you have to produce more electricity to serve an electric vehicle fleet, well, you can't increase those pollutants. But at the same time, by moving to plug-in electric vehicles, you're reducing emissions of NOx and VOCs. So that means that you are seeing an ozone reduction, particularly in large concentrations of these vehicles in urban areas. And so those greenish areas that you see on the graphic, those are all areas where we have significant ozone reduction. Now, there's a similar story with particulate matter, which is obviously a very important health concern. And that's a case where you have, again, the precursors to particulate matter, like NOx, coming down from the vehicles that help overall lower what's called secondary particulate matter. Now, at the same time, you could be increasing, and in our study, we didn't, for the air quality portion, we didn't factor in a cleaner grid over time. So if you were to pump up greater use of coal technologies, then you could have localized impacts of particulate matter. And you have to make sure that that is not the case. We don't feel like, we feel strongly that no populations should be exposed to larger concentrations of pollutions as a result of, even though as a national basis we're getting a benefit. I want to just quickly run through some federal policies in the U.S. that are helping to drive forth electrification. Next week, we're expecting next week that what's called the national program in the U.S., which is the first ever greenhouse gas tailpipe standards going through model year 2016, along with revamped CAFE standards or corporate average fuel economy standards. Those are going to be coming out next week, the final versions, and those get you to roughly 35 miles per gallon in model year 2016. So those need to keep on increasing. There's already an incentive for the automakers to make electric vehicles to help comply with that standard, because electric vehicles are so much cleaner. It's an average standard. So if they make an electric vehicle, then that really helps their average quite a lot. If you were in our one of the auto panels yesterday, the representative from Toyota said, what they need are performance-based, technology-neutral performance-based standards, and they need incentives. Well, I just talked about the performance standards. The second one, the reason I bring up the federal clean energy and climate bills in the Congress, while the House of Representatives has passed the bill, as you all know, and the Senate is in their deliberation stages, what those provide is a huge amount of funding and incentives to keep making these vehicles. And I'll go into a little more detail there. Finally, cleaning up the fuels, we can follow the same process, and that is putting in place a low-carbon fuel standard. And British Columbia has a policy like that. We tried to get one nationally in the U.S. right now, where we have one in California, but we need to push that out nationally, and I'll talk very quickly about what that means. So when I talk about the incentives in the climate bills, we're talking about over $24 billion that could potentially go to the auto industry just for retooling so that they can make cleaner vehicles. And there's a big chunk of that goes directly to plug-in vehicle manufacturing and also to deployment programs. Just very quickly on what the low-carbon fuel standard is, and analogous to sort of tailpipe standards on the vehicles, the low-carbon fuel standard is a performance standard, technology neutral for the fuel supply. And what it says is, in the case of California, by 2020, the carbon intensity, meaning the grams of carbon per megajoule of fuel sold, has to go down by 10% by 2020. So it looks at all the fuels, and we currently have what's called a renewable fuel standard in the U.S. That's very much just a biofuels volumetric standard. But the advantage of a program like this, technology neutral, it brings in electricity. And if you heard one of the previous panels, the fact that an LCFS exists here in British Columbia is driving quite an awareness in BC Hydro to take a look at. There's the potential for huge credits to be earned. Those credits under the low-carbon fuel standard for electric vehicles or electricity as a fuel could be passed on to consumers and do a lot to help put the infrastructure in place. So just to tie it up, plug-in vehicles are an essential component of a clean energy strategy to get us off oil and to solve our global climate problem. And there's a lot of things that the utility commissions can do to help speed this process along, and also federal policy can be a great driver. Thank you very much.